Some people fail to understand how much of a success All Things Must Pass was back in 1970. It wasn't only the first triple disc album rock music ever saw, or the most commercially successful album ever released by a Beatle. More than anything, it was solid evidence that when George Harrison said he was a world-class songwriter and was being held back by the others, he was not lying. With this in mind, it wouldn't be that crazy to call this one of the best debuts of all time, if it weren't for the fact that this wasn't a debut. Talking about George Harrison in this channel is something that I will always enjoy, for a variety of reasons. Number one, I know that a lot of you guys will disagree with me, so you'll leave a comment, and I'll leave a comment, and we can have a wonderful conversation in the comments section. But also because I never really understood the man. I've studied the man's life for years now, and I can definitely tell you with 100% confidence that I have no clue on how his brain worked. It was so unexpected, so exciting as well, and so weird. The decisions he made, and not from a business point of view, because I don't give a fuck about that, but when it comes to art, when it comes to how he handled, his creative output, is so weird and so quirky as well. Now, the lore of the Beatles in the late 60s, especially 68 and 69, is very convoluted and thick. It's almost impossible to get all the details, but honestly, it doesn't really matter how much detail you add to the idea of the Wonderwall music album and the Electronic Sounds album that would make it make sense. These albums are just really weird. Not only when it comes to music, but the sole fact of George agreeing to make this album is weird, especially when years before, in albums like Rubber Soul, Help, and Revolver, he was crafting some of his best songs and was gaining a little bit more protagonism in the songwriting front of the band. And I say this because a lot of people, including George Harrison, seem to believe that he was being ignored by his bandmates, when in reality he was already getting more songs by the time Revolver came out, an album where he has 3 out of 14 songs, which is not really a bad ratio considering the fact that you have 3 songwriters in the band. And honestly, it's not like they had an option, because George Harrison was writing some of the best songs by the band in 1965 and 1966. I mean, If I Needed Someone, the fuzz bass of Think For Yourself, the volume pedal and romanticism of I Need You, the trippy nature of Love You Too, introducing a new genre to Western society. You have the political nature of Taxman, the powerful dissonance in the song I Want to Tell You. Like, there's so many examples of George Harrison being at a songwriting peak in those years. And even though Norwegian Wood and Love You Too had already shown a George Harrison that was more prone to this kind of music, he was still a rock artist, and that changed in 1967 with the release of albums like Sgt. Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour, songs like Blue Jay Way, Within You Without You, not some of his best. And you also have him writing songs like It's All Too Much, Only a Northern Song, once again songs that don't really represent the quality that he was showcasing in 1965 and 1966. And I'm making this long intro so you understand what I mean when I say that his downfall in the songwriting front of the band happened because of nobody but himself. The quality of his songwriting in 1967 was not it. Instead, John Lennon and Paul McCartney were writing songs like Penny Lane, Strawberry Fields Forever, A Day in the Life, Getting Better, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, and so on and so forth. Some of the best songs of 1967 and of all time, actually. It was around this time that he started to work on the songs for the soundtrack of the Wonderwall film, and I have to say, some of these compositions are actually really nice, especially In the Park, in my opinion, the highlight of this entire 52 minutes of music. Now, I have to confess that I'm not really that well versed when it comes to the instruments that were used for this album, so I do apologize if my take on a lot of these songs are kind of vague. But in this particular song, George Harrison kind of deviates from Indian classical music to create an ambient piece. And it works really well because the subtle percussion and the strings have like this dance that continues through the whole track and makes you feel really invested and in the moment. You have other songs that do something relatively similar, like the song Dwelling at Home, where he uses a more conventional Western style of instrumentation to make the listener feel more invested or in the moment when you're watching the movie. You have songs that flirt with the psychedelic quite a bit, like Dream Scene and Love Scene, for example, that may not be my favorite songs in the album, but do a really good job at creating an atmosphere when you're watching the movie, once again, which is the whole point of a soundtrack, really. You have songs like Part of Succumba, for example, that sort of prelude the texture that his music in the 70s was going to have, especially in albums like All Things Must Pass. You can hear the sound of the guitar, and it's almost like you're listening to the intro of My Sweet Lord. There's definitely a few songs you're going to enjoy if you like this sort of music and if you like soundtrack albums, because the music is very cinematic. The problem is that this is a 57-minute album and it has 22 tracks. Therefore, I don't really think it's worth it sitting through 40 minutes of terrible compositions that don't really represent Indian culture at its finest just to listen to the 10 minutes that are actually good. But even if you don't don't like the album, I guess we must admit the fact that this was a very important album for George Harrison, because believe me when I tell you that without Wonderwall music, George Harrison would have probably left the Beatles before the making of Abbey Road, and maybe even the making of the White Album, even though it was mostly ready by the time this album was released. The reason is very simple. George Harrison was really invested in Indian culture by the end of 1967. That's why the Beatles went to India. They were following him. They were trying to please him. They were trying to do something for George. Even though technically the leader was Paul McCartney, George Harrison was like the spiritual leader, He wanted the Beatles to have more experiences like the ones they had when they tried LSD for the first time or weed for the first time with Bob Dylan. And Indian music, meditation, and that culture, religion overall, was that for him. It gave him that release that he needed. And making this album was a really big part of, fulfilling that need, that artistic need he had at the time of making music with this culture and overall sound in mind. A lot of you will probably say this is just me reading too much into it. However, the fact that he never released another Indian-inspired song after the release of Wonderwall music is more than enough evidence. So even if I do think that this was probably the most underwhelming way to start your solo career, I do believe this album was somewhat important because he needed that release to continue evolving as a songwriter, and without this album, we probably wouldn't have songs like Here Comes the Sun, Something, and While My Guitar Gently Weeps. I do believe that. However, when it comes to electronic sounds, I really don't understand the point of this album, really. It's an experiment album, basically. Not an experimental album, no, an experiment. He was basically trying out the Moog synthesizer, and by the way, if I see anyone in the comments correcting me about how to say Moog or Maug or Mch, I'm gonna kill myself, okay? You know what I'm talking about. You know the electronic device I'm referring to, so stop it. No one cares. Focus on what I'm saying about the thing, not the way I said the thing. Basically, what you're listening to when you're listening to this album is George Harrison playing around with the Moog. Nothing more than that. There's no songwriting. There's no plan before hitting the recording. Actually, the second song, I think, No Time or Space, isn't even George Harrison playing. It's his friend Bernie Krause, and Bernie was really offended about the fact that George Harrison recorded the whole thing without his knowledge, because a lot of the things he did while showing George Harrison how to play it, he intended to record not long after for his own discography, so technically George kind of played him dirty. Now, I've talked about avant-garde music on this channel quite a lot. There's a few projects that I do enjoy from this genre, but overall I think it's one of the most insulting and disrespectful genres ever made, because other genres of music like jazz, like rock music, like folk, can have elements of avant-garde music in them and make it interesting. However, when the whole purpose of the album is to be avant-garde, you're left with a lack of formula, lack of sound palette, and lack of identity overall that makes the whole thing feel like the absence of music rather than an actual musical statement. There's other examples like the Unfinished Music Trilogy by John Lennon and Yoko Ono, but at least those albums have an actual plan or idea behind them. Albums like Life with the Lions, for example, are supposed to represent or narrate the story of a miscarriage Yoko Ono had in 1969. Two Virgins is supposed to be the waltz of two different colliding ideologies coming together. Yoko Ono's vocalizing and John Lennon's random playing in the studio. This album resembles a little more what they try to do on the Wedding album, where they're basically just calling each other's name. There's not a single chord played. There's nothing you can actually call music, and that's exactly how this album makes me feel. George himself claimed that the whole recording was basically him turning a few knobs and pushing a few buttons and hoping that a good sound came out of it. And while that's not necessarily a bad approach, especially when you look at genres like jazz music and EDM that benefit greatly from improvisation, I believe that you do need a plan going into the recording of this, which he didn't have, or you need a certain mastery of the instrument you're working with. And given the fact that the only instrument featured on this album is the Moog, well, you do need to know a little bit more about the instrument before you decide to release an album. And listen, the quality of the album isn't really what bothers me the most, because he has a number of incredible albums in the 70s and the 80s. My problem with the record is that around this time, George claimed that he had a bunch of songs ready to be recorded, and instead of recording those songs and releasing them as a solo album, he wouldn't be the first one to do so since John Lennon was already doing that. And instead of giving us an EP of songs like Window Window, All Things Must Pass, Isn't It a Pity, songs that we know he had ready by the time he recorded this album, he gave us this. This was a solo album we were all waiting for, with all the songs that he wasn't allowed to record when he was with the Beatles. That's the thing that bothers me the most. It seems like through the entirety of the early 70s, George Harrison was constantly talking about about all of the songs that he wasn't allowed to record with the Beatles, but we don't really know what those songs were. I made a video about this recently, talking about George Harrison's constant complaints about all the music that he couldn't record. And the reason I talk about this so often is because it's really intriguing. Once again, George Harrison is one of the greatest songwriters of all time, in my opinion. And when I listen to some of the demos from the Get Back sessions, the White Album sessions, and the Abbey Road sessions, I want to know what happened to those songs. Like Window Window, for example, like the early versions of Isn't It a Pity. What happened to those recordings? What happened to those melodies? Why didn't he record them when he had the opportunity to do so? A couple of times during the recording of the Get Back documentary, we saw George Harrison putting the idea out there of making a solo album so he can get his songs out of the way and focus only on new songs made for the Beatles.
You know, I've got so many songs that I've got like my quota of tunes for the next 10 years or albums. Yeah. I'd just like to maybe do an album of songs on your own. Yeah, you know, because all these songs of mine I could give to people who could do them good, but I suddenly realized, fuck all that. I'm just gonna do me for a bit.
And before you guys say that all of those songs were released in All Things Must Pass, we know that that's not necessarily true, because even those songs like, once again, Isn't It a Pity, If Not For You, All Things Must Pass, and songs like My Sweet Lord were written around the time he was still with the Beatles. Most of the songs in that album were new compositions by George Harrison after he left the band. So if the sources are correct, then we could assume that all the songs he wanted to record in early 1969, enough to make an album or two, are songs that we never really got to hear, a vast majority of them at least. And instead of releasing those songs or recording those songs or making an EP out of those songs when he had the opportunity to make a solo project, he decided to make electronic sounds. That's ridiculous. However, there's a few ways you can sort of explain why Electronic Sounds was released and those other songs were never released or recorded. Number one, and probably the most likely one, is that the Beatles only approved Electronic Sounds because it's not really a proper album. It doesn't feature any vocals or any, actual effort to make a trendy song that would be successful in the mainstream. Maybe the PR team, the label, or the Beatles themselves wouldn't approve the album if it was a proper release with songs like the finished version of Window Window, All Things Must Pass, Isn't It a Pity, I Be Mine, songs we know he had ready back then. That explains it, and it makes a lot of sense too. However, it's a little hard to believe when simultaneously John was releasing a whole trilogy with his wife. Why was he allowed to release albums but George wasn't? But yeah, that is my opinion on George Harrison's solo debuts. Believe me when I tell you, I will never understand the thought process of this man. He had such a unique way to look at music and to approach the songwriting of an album, to approach the creative process, of making an album. But sometimes it was a little too unique, not only when he was with the Beatles, but also in his solo discography, and that resulted in some of his most questionable releases. Of course, the main reason why I make these videos in the first place is because I want to know your opinion. So what do you think? Do you think I'm being too harsh? Do you think there's a lot of good music packed into these two albums, or do you think this is the lowest point of George Harrison as a solo artist? And once again, in my opinion, even though I understand why Wonderwall music was made, and even though I understand that maybe Electronic Sounds is not the album he wanted to do, but the album he was allowed to do, that doesn't really change the fact that this is by far the most confusing and pointless moment out of his entire solo discography.
Sort of wears off and it comes back again. Like just recently I feel quite excited to be alive, regardless of whether I'm making a record or promoting my record. Buy my album now, right?
And that is going to be it for today's video. I really hope that you guys enjoyed watching as much as I enjoyed making it. If you did, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any other videos that I upload. If you want me to talk about any other topics related to music, if you want me to check out a song, an album, or an artist, leave it down below as well, and I'll make sure to read it and fulfill your request as soon as I can. Once again, I hope that you enjoyed, and I hope that I can see you soon with a new video. But until then, bye.